is Yurai Chiba. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Princeton Theological Seminary studying Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. So when we think about the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, it's a pretty large group of texts that were written sometime probably between what we consider the Iron Age, maybe 11th century, 10th century, and then down into perhaps the 3rd or 2nd centuries at the latest end. And the world was, as you might be able to imagine, very different. We're talking about the kingdoms of Israel and Judah when we think about the Old Testament. These are two relatively small kingdoms in what is currently Israel-Palestine. And their constant state of being as a civilization was that they were caught between two relatively large powers. You have Mesopotamia on the east, and you have Egypt to the south and the west. And traditionally, these have always been we would call the superpowers in the region. The actual political power would have changed hands quite a bit, especially in Mesopotamia. You had the Babylonians much earlier, but in a lot of the biblical periods that we're talking about the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. But they were all these people groups that used the Akkadian language. The Akkadian language was a written language that's a combination of logographic script and phonetic script, sort of like Japanese actually. They wrote this script on clay tablets, and so there is some awareness of this kind of culture to the east, and there's definitely some kind of contact between broadly Babylonian or Assyrian cultures and biblical cultures, Israel, Judah. And then you have Egypt, big civilization along the Nile River. We've all heard of Egypt, you know?
I think so.
Yeah. You know, we have vague familiarity with the pyramids and like the pharaohs and whatnot. But they left a lot of writing behind because they had a very early written culture. Because of Egypt's climate itself isn't that conducive to the preservation of texts, but their tombs are. And so their tombs are very dry. They aren't exposed. So we have a lot of written texts on papyrus even that's left over from Egypt. The reason sort of this matters for considering the Bible is because, first of all, they do come up in the Bible. If you think about the Exodus, right, obviously that is very much related to Egypt. You think about the exile, the Babylonian exile. It's called the Babylonian exile because you have forces coming over from Babylon and destroying their culture and civilization and deporting them towards Babylon. And so there's always this sense that there are these sort of weaker players that speak a completely different language from these superpowers, and they're trying to negotiate their own place in this wider geopolitical field. And so I think that's that's just one thing, but that's kind of the world that they live in. Obviously they don't have airplanes and like trains and these kinds of mass transportation that we do today, so they're a little bit more isolated than they would be today. But in like the Bronze Age, Egypt was a superpower in Israel-Palestine. You see Egyptian cultural influence in the artifacts that we dig up from there. And Egypt had direct control over that area because they used to be rivals with the Hittite Empire up in the north in Anatolia. And so Israel-Palestine functioned as a kind of buffer area between Egypt and the Hittites. So, and then they came into contact with the first Assyrian Empire as well. So Israel-Palestine was always kind of caught in between. And so that's sort of their place. They're always a little bit vulnerable. In the big scheme of things. That's kind of where I would start. Literacy was not very common. scholars estimate somewhere between 5%, somewhere around 5% for Mesopotamia, maybe 7%, upwards of 10% actually in Egypt. But the point being, people who could read and write were very, very rare. We don't have an enormous amount of evidence for the specific institutions that they had, like, schooling, whatnot. We have some images of, like, scribes. Generally, scholars will talk about people who can write in the ancient world as scribes. That's largely because it seems that there was a profession that involved reading and writing. And these were the people who would write down the laws. These were the people who would write letters from one king to another king. These were the people who would also occasionally write down oral stories, and they would write down maybe epic stories about gods and deities, and maybe other traditional tales as well, which has some parallels with the biblical narrative. There were scribes in Egypt, and there were scribes in Mesopotamia, and there were scribes most certainly in the regions in between. Example from Nehemiah chapter 8. We have a scribe named Ezra who brings out the Torah, right, the law, quote unquote. Probably more than just a set of laws. It's probably all the teachings, maybe including the narratives of what we consider the Bible today. He reads this out loud to the entire congregation of Israel, and then there are a class of people. We usually consider them priests. In the Bible, they're referred to as Levites, that help to translate and interpret these things for the people. You see sort of a double mediation here. First of all, obviously no one is reading, except for Ezra the scribe here. He has the knowledge to read this rather large scroll that has the teachings of Israel that are important to Israel and Israel's God. And then you have a class of people who then are helping to maybe translate it for an audience. That this is Nehemiah takes place after the return of the Israelites from exile. So a lot of the people who are returning probably speak a different language. They no longer speak Hebrew. They probably speak Aramaic. So maybe that's what's going on here. They're translating for people who no longer know the sort of sacred language per se. They're talking about how to think about these things. You have scribes and priests functioning as intermediaries. They are the ones that carry forth knowledge from the past and try to interpret it for the present. I think there are a few things that we can say from this. Does it mean that these scribes or priests determine the faith of the rest of the masses? I think that would be a stretch. Even if you imagine like this fully modern authoritarian society, it's a little bit hard to imagine these sort of higher ups, or these elites, having complete control over what everybody else believes. That's very unlikely, I think, especially in the ancient world, where you don't have mass communications, you don't have the internet, you don't have modern surveillance, but you do have like smaller bodies of people. You have smaller populations. You have smaller villages where presumably there would be like a village chief. You have authority structures over smaller bodies of people. There's a lot of debate about this because there's no hard evidence for what exactly the religious landscape looked like back in biblical times. But it seems very possible, for example, that there were itinerant priests. There are priests that would go from village to village or town to town. Maybe they're teaching something. Maybe they're conducting certain rituals that are important. You might also have scribes that are doing something similar. You definitely have people who are taking messages from one place to another, because letter writing is quite common in the ancient world. There's travel and contact between more remote areas and these more central urban areas. And so, in that sense, I think priests do have an influence, and scribes also have an influence on what people believe. If there is something authoritative like the law, right, only scribes can read it. And so only they know what it says.
Mm.
And in the ancient world, sometimes even kings don't necessarily read and write. Often what happens is that if they want a law to become the law of the land, they aren't going to write it themselves. A scribe writes it down for them. Same goes for prophecy, actually. Prophets don't write down their own words. Usually have a scribe write it down. The main biblical reference for this is Jeremiah. You have a named scribe writing down the words of the Lord from the mouth of Jeremiah. But this is actually reflected in a set of letters in Mesopotamia called the Mari letters. There's some practice of oracles or oral prophecy. The letters seem to indicate that they weren't the ones writing it down, that they would call on the scribe to record them. It's actually a fairly complex dynamic, I think. Faith is not just one person dictating something and everybody's like, well, we don't have a choice, so we gotta believe this. It's always, there are a lot of intermediaries. You have prophets that want to say something. The scribes write it down. The scribes don't change it completely, but they might change it a little bit. We have a little bit of evidence for that. We have multiple oracles recorded in different sources, so we can sort of compare them. And it seems like there are conventions that the scribes are trying to fit in. There are genre conventions that make an oracle legible or understandable, and so they have some level of control there. And then you have these priests or other figures who seem to be able to write, who seem to have an education that have been taught something about these teachings from the past. And then they are sort of the people who the authorities who are looked up to, that teach them to people who don't have that education. That's sort of the broad landscape of what's going on. There is some rhetoric about the correctness of a single stream of interpretation in the Bible. There's a lot of reason to believe that there are competing strands of tradition, even in the Old Testament. A really obvious example is 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. If you compare them together, they sound pretty darn similar. There is a lot of material in Chronicles that's not in Kings. There are some major omissions, like the David and Bathsheba story from Kings is not in Chronicles. But otherwise, they're very, very similar. It seems that Chronicles was written with Kings as its basis. Maybe it consulted other sources too, but Kings seems to be a source for Chronicles. But there are differences, right? And so that means that there's some kind of interpretive move going on here. The David and Bathsheba story, for example, like that changes how we view David as a king. That would have been, at some point in history, a scribe would have had to do that. And so, maybe it was on someone's orders. It's hard to say. Especially over time, you have different schools of thought. You have changes in thinking happening even within the Bible. Now, the really famous example of kind of competing strands of tradition is what's called the documentary hypothesis for the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. The Pentateuch, because Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are considered the 5 books of Moses, right? The traditional interpretation, traditional understanding is that they were the books that were revealed to Moses on Sinai. Read through the 5 books of Moses, you'll notice sections, relatively long sections, where you see God referred to as Elohim, and you'll see other sections where he's referred to as Yahweh or Adonai. And this got people thinking that, these sections, their content also seems a little different. Genesis 1 and 2, there seems to be, redundancies. There seem to be redundant tellings of the same story, double tellings of the same story. Maybe, these were originally different source materials that got somehow combined together at some point. And that's how we got the Pentateuch today. There are at least 2 or more sources of tradition that are being combined without necessarily erasing the redundancies, without necessarily erasing some of the contradictions that arise from that. They're combined and they're just allowed to sort of sit there together. That's something we see in the Pentateuch. That's something really interesting to look out for next time when you read through. One thing I would glean out of all this information is that just as there's a tradition of Christian interpretation throughout history, there's a lot of interpretive activity going on in biblical times too. There's this idea that maybe the Bible needed to be revealed, the words of God needed to be revealed in very specific locations, very specific times, in a very specific way. But the story of the Bible that I just described to you is a little bit messier. There's a lot of sort of back and forth. There are some competing interpretations. Even if they're not competing, there are multiple interpretations of creation, the flood, the legacy of David the king, all kinds of things. God reveals His word through human activity and human language, and human language is deeply contextual. It has meaning based on the immediate context that it's kind of uttered in, whether it's in a specific conversation, in a specific location, a specific culture. There is a way in which the Bible is able to hold speech from a number of different places and times, and to hold that together. This sort of holding together of different traditions and multiple interpretations reveals something both about the complexity of the reality that God has created, but it also speaks to kind of Job's experience of God. There is this way that I just think that the world needs to be, or though there's this way that I feel that I just don't understand, like why this is happening to me. I just don't know why the world is like this. And I think there's a sense when we read the Bible that we can't explain everything. There's a sense in which God's self is very complicated. God is beyond, like theologically speaking, God is beyond human knowledge. And so I think thinking about the Bible is a resource for Christians, and as such I think there are some things that it can teach us in relatively clear language, but also I think it teaches us to be humble about what we think we know about God. And I think it teaches us to be prayerful in our approach to God's Word, because it's not the answer key to a multiple choice test. It's not this thing we can just scan through a machine. There's a lot of people's memories. There are a lot of layers in between the reader today and I guess what we call the truth. Jesus teaches us that if we become His disciples, then we'll know the truth, and the truth will set us free. And I think there's some way to hold in tension both this faith in God and in God's truth, and also in sort of the humility of saying, even God's word is difficult for us to understand sometimes. That's what I would take away.